Hey everybody, this is chapter 1 of Open Marxism, Critical Theory as Militant Enlightenment by Christos Memos. And here we are. Let's get started. Chapter 1 is titled Marxian Theory as an Open-Ended Project. This chapter reflects on the meaning of open Marxism and critically outlines its historical background, origins, nature, and trajectory. Open Marxism is discussed as a distinct theoretical current and is a strain and a continuation of the critical Marxist tradition that has been developed since the close of the Second World War in both Western and Eastern Europe. The chapter follows the evolution of open Marxism from the original and critical use of the term in the 1950s by Axelos in the journal Argument. I think that's how you say it, Argument, or Arguments. Focusing primarily on the work of Maximilien Rubel and Daniel Guérin through open Marxism as it was developed in Eastern Europe, especially in the scholarly work of the Praxis Group in Yugoslavia, Polish open Marxism in the writings of Karol Kosik in Czechoslovakia, to Agnoli's work in post-1968 West Germany, and finally to the works developed within the framework of the Conference of Socialist Economists, CSE, in Britain since the 1980s by Bonafelt, Clark, Gunn, and Holloway. Taking into account the complex history of the open Marxism tradition and the changes to the meaning of open Marxism that have occurred since the term was originally used, the chapter argues that the evolution of the open Marxist tradition has to be understood as a process of critical interaction with the prevailing socio-historical conditions and other currents of thought that owed much to Marx and to a critical Marxist tradition, which was developed inter alia by the early works of Lukács, Korsch, and in particular Adorno and the early Frankfurt School. New section: The Open Marxism of Kostas Axelos and the French journal Argument. And I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right or not, but forgive me. In France, the post-Second World War theoretical and political developments were arguably marked by the collapse of the country in 1940 and the role that the resistance movement played during the German occupation. Although Catholics in Gaulish participated in the resistance, it was obvious that the French Communist Party and the left, and by extension socialist and communist intellectuals, gained in prestige as a result of the primary role they played in it. In 1945, the Communist Party reached the peak of its influence and won 5 million votes in the national elections, and by 1947 it had 900,000 members. However, in spite of its rising popularity and electoral gains, the Communist Party largely remained a typical Leninist-Stalinist political formation, which was highly centralized and bureaucratic. Authoritarian political practices and attitudes in line with blind obedience and adherence to the party's, quote, correct line were blended with overwhelming patriotism and subterranean chauvinism, and the ludicrous personality cult of its Secretary General, Maurice Thorez. Against this background, the French Communist Party appeared rather reluctant to follow a path of de-Stalinization, which had an enormous impact at both the theoretical and political levels on the kind of dogmatic and codified Marxism that remained dominant in France immediately after the liberation. Its theoretical and political predominance within the Marxist tradition in France, along with the belated French translation and dissemination of key parts of Marx's writings, may in part explain, quote, the slow development of an open Marxism in France, end quote. Poster, 1975. However, the effects of the political crisis in Eastern Europe, and in particular the Hungarian events of 1956, proved to be profound and far-reaching, and arguably they undermined and diminished the theoretical and political credibility of orthodox Marxism and Stalinist ideology. It became increasingly possible, both intellectually and politically, to subject the orthodoxy of Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism to fierce criticism and denounce the Soviet Union's domestic and international policies, and yet remain on the left politically. Marxian and critical contemporary Marxist thought was used as an unremitting means of critique of traditional Marxism, and this process of reevaluation, which took place within Marxism and the left, was cross-fertilized and impregnated with the intense intellectual ferment in France at the end of the Second World War. This evolution led to a change in the direction of intellectual discourse towards the critical philosophical tradition. the conceptual framework of which was regarded as a highly suitable tool to undertake an in-depth analysis of the events and preoccupations of the time. This shift was facilitated by the renaissance of Hegel's work and the rediscovery of Hegel's ideas, in conjunction with an increasing interest in Marx's writings, which led to a critical reappraisal of key Marxian concepts with an emphasis on the supposedly more radically humanist aspects of Marx's works. A renewed interest in Hegel's work, primarily in the phenomenology of spirit and its radical interpretation by Kojève and Hippolyte, I don't know if I'm saying that right, occurred alongside a growth of interest in Marx's early writings, particularly in his economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. Moreover, Husserl and Heidegger were included in the emerging critical dialogue or were read in conjunction with Marx's Paris manuscripts. Consequently, the French intellectual landscape witnessed the emergence of a variety of philosophical strands such as Hegelian Marxism, Heideggerian Marxism, Freudo-Marxism, phenomenological Marxism, existentialism. In contrast to the economism of the Second and Third Internationals, these currents of thought sought to locate the philosophical content of Marxism at the epicenter of their endeavor to renew Marxian theory and remove the elements of scientificism. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Maybe it's scientificism. I don't know. Technicism and positivism within it. The translation and critical rethinking of Georg Lukács's History and Class Consciousness and Karl Korsch's Marxism and Philosophy arguably contributed significantly to this undertaking. However, despite the flourishing of these disparate versions of Marxism, each of which claimed to provide a non-dogmatic reading of Marx's work, the ideological power that the orthodox Marxism of the French Communist Party exerted over French political and intellectual thought remained powerful and dominant. Against this background and the influence of Jean-Paul Sartre in the journal Les Thèmes Modernes aside, the journal's arguments, Société sans Barbarie and Internationale Situationniste, created a public forum for the critique of dogmatism and orthodox Marxism and functioned as a laboratory for the development of critical and radical ideas. The journal Argument, which was first published in 1956 and folded in 1962, developed into a critical space for theoretical debate that sought to transcend the sectarianism of the left and strove for a, quote, opening up of Marxism towards new intellectual currents and new social phenomena, end quote. Poster. Argument was edited principally by scholars who attempted to simultaneously remain affiliated to the left, being mostly ex-communist, and maintain a critical perspective, while also standing at a critical distance from the Cold War period's anti-communist hysteria. Argument brought together as editors or contributing authors, intellectuals and radical thinkers such as Edgar Morin, Jean Duvignon, Pierre Fougaille-Roulard, Maurice Blanchot, Gilles Deleuze, Roland Barthes, François Fejtu, Henri Lefebvre, Lucien Goldman, Pierre Neville, Daniel Guérin, Maximilien Rubel, and Kostas Axelos, who sought to think beyond, quote, orthodox Marxism and to formulate counter-arguments to the ideological use of Marx. The journal significantly fostered the development of critical thought in post-war France and contributed to an opening up of Marxism, which followed different perspectives and directions opened up mainly by the works of Axelos, Rubel, and Guérin. Footnote. Also, for Lefebvre's Open Marxism, see Charnock's article, Challenging New State Spatialities, The Open Marxism of Henri Lefebvre. For a dialogue between Axelos and Lefebvre, see Stuart Eldon, Mondialisation, Before Globalization, Lefebvre and Axelos. In Kanishka Gunavardena, Stefan Kipfer, Richard Milgram, and Christian Schmidt's edited volume, Space, Difference, Everyday Life, Reading Henri Lefebvre. According to Lefebvre, quote, Kostas Axelos opens the horizon, shows the way, end quote. End footnote. Kostas Axelos, 1924 to 2010, joined the editorial board of Argument in 1958 and acted as its editor-in-chief from 1960 to 1962. Kostas Axelos perceived Argument as a collective project with the goal of elaborating a, quote, open Marxism, of a revised and corrected Freudo-Marxism, and finally, a post-Marxism and post-Heideggerian thought, end quote. And he emphatically stressed that Marx was not, quote, an orthodox Marxist, end quote. After the profound impact of the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, Axelos wrote, quote, "We tried to adventure at the end of 1956 and the beginning of 1957, end quote. We tried an adventure at the end of 1956 and the beginning of 1957, end quote, noting that, quote, events in Poland and Hungary seemed to have opened some rifts, end quote. Quoted in Premat, 2004, page 113. A key point in Axelos' elaboration of Marxian thought is that, quote, there is a dogmatic element in Marxist thought itself, the closure of many questions, end quote. See Axelos in Memos, 2009, page 134. The pre-existing dogmatic and closed elements of Marxist theorizing allowed and made possible its orthodox Marxist interpretations, thus taking the form of an ossified and established theory and practice. In other words, Axelos argued that certain aspects of Marxist thought provided the basis for the conversion of Marxism into an ideology and a theoretical tool of domination and suppression that served the ruling classes in Stalinist societies and smoothed the development of reformism and the fatalism of the social democracy of the Second International. Axelos acknowledged that there is a discontinuity and a deep divide that separates Marx from the various Marxist versions, but at the same time he underscored that there was something within the Marxian thought that led it to its transformation into a reified ideology. In this context, Axelos argued that Marx could be seen as a representative of Western humanism, since the most forceful aspects of Marx's work is permeated by the concept of technique, which pervades and dominates the Western humanism tradition. This fundamental element of Marx's thought was the one that materialized and put into practice in the policies of Stalinism and social democracy. At the core of Axelos' approach is Axelos' conviction that, quote, more than science, it is technique that affects Marx's enterprise, end quote. Kostas Axelos, 1976. Marx attacked Hegel's metaphysics by using metaphysical ideas. Marx tried to invert the Hegelian metaphysics in which history was seen as the place and time for absolute spirit to deploy absolute spirit's self. But Marx was led by the metaphysical concept to comprehend history as the history of the development of technique. The concept of technique unites Marx's thought and constitutes the center of the Marxian problematic. It is the philosophical core that was included in the Paris manuscripts of 1844 and became the seed of Marx's later theoretical elaborations. It is this central point that later developed into an established and codified doctrine. Marxist technicism constituted a significant part of what can be called the dogmatic element in Marx's thought and led to the forestalling of many lines of critical thought. It also made possible the reification of Marx's thinking and the development of orthodox and closed Marxism. Closed Marxism took on various forms, including those adopted by sects of Marxist-Leninist, Stalinist, and Trotskyist persuasion, and the established ideology of bureaucratic regimes, all of which promoted the technicist elements of Marx's work. Consequently, technicism became dominant in both the theory and the historical realization of orthodox Marxism, and sectarian, quote, isms prevailed, thereby transforming Marxian thought into systematized theory and reactionary dogma. In contrast to these forms of Marxism, Axelos argued for a, quote, openness, which is not articulated for the sake of, quote, openness, and certainly contravenes nihilism and the fascination with the void and the cult of nothingness and insignificance. This postulate for a new type of critical thought necessitated getting rid of vain and empty polemics, thus striving to overcome the dryness of Marxism in order to release its more animate, vital, and relevant forces. Axelos' approach was rooted in his view that transcending the deformation of Marxism necessitated an opening of Marxist thought, and Axelos coined the term, quote, open Marxism. As Axelos put it, quote, by using the term, quote, open Marxism, I meant a theoretical current, which never came into being as a movement, and which, in opposition to Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, Maoism, did not render Marxism an ideology of power, but attempted to pose fruitful questions and demystify the so-called, quote, existing relations, end quote. Lukács and Korsch made an effort, but Lukács and Korsch's contemplative measures were limited. Any kind of action, political or non-political, cannot be defined a priori. End quote. Kostas Axelos. Axelos is undertaking to overcome the closure and metamorphosis of Marxism into an ideology of power entailed the deployment of a penetrating and demystifying mode of thinking that sought to broaden horizons and to render Marx a more problematic thinker than is actually the case. This is a discourse that foregrounds questioning thought and complex enigmatic responses, which could eventually lead to the bursting of Marxist, Trotskyist, Stalinist, anarchist schematizations and beyond them. Drawing upon Heraclitus's poetic thought, Axelos's open Marxism is principally articulated as a project that seeks to open up Marx's more original and creative thinking, e.g. the concept of alienation, and putting it into a productive dialogue with other thinkers including Hegel, Nietzsche, and Heidegger, with the aim of bringing it back to a, quote, much more basic wandering, end quote. Axelos. Axelos made an effort to read Marx in conjunction with Heidegger because, despite the considerable incompatibilities of Marx and Heidegger's respective works, Axelos was impressed by what Axelos perceived to be a, quote, concurrent affinity between what Marx calls alienation and Heidegger oblivion of being, end quote. Axelos. Therefore, in his work on Marx and Heidegger, Axelos sought to elaborate a future thought, one that could think through them and eventually, quote, beyond them, end quote. Axelos. Footnote. For Axelos's work on Marx and Heidegger, see especially Kostas Axelos's 1966 book, this is German, Einführung in ein künftiges Denken über Marx und Heidegger. Oh, it was translated in 2015 as An Introduction to Future Ways of Thought on Marx and Heidegger. For Axelos's critique of Marx, see Axelos's Vers la pensée planétaire, Towards Planetary Thinking, published in 1964. 1969, Argument d'une Recherche, Arguments of a Research, published in 1970. I'm not actually sure what these dates are. Anyway, the article Marx, Freud, and the Undertaking of Thought in the Future, 1976. Alienation, Praxis, and Techne, and the Thought of Karl Marx, published in 1982. Actually, don't listen to these dates. Theses on Marx article published in Continuity and Change in Marxism, edited by N. Fisher, L. Patsouris, and N. Georgopoulos, or Georgopoulos. Anyway, end footnote. Footnote. Axelos met Heidegger in 1955, and their friendship lasted until 1962 to 1963. In 1960, Axelos translated Heidegger's What is Philosophy into French. In Axelos's opinion, Heidegger, quote, was a great thinker and a narrow-minded petty bourgeois at the same time, end quote, whose thought, quote, is an opening, end quote, although marked but not entirely reduced and limited to the, quote, shadow of Heidegger's affiliation with with Nazism. End footnote. Axelos also co-translated Lukács's most influential book, History and Class Consciousness, with Jacqueline Boy. Prior to its publication in French as a book, chapters of Lukács's book had first been published in Argument. Lukács sent a letter to Argument complaining about the translation, reproduction, and publication of chapter of his book in the journal against his will and without his authorization. Footnote. Detailing the reasons for withholding this translation and publication, Lukács reiterated the viewpoint that Lukács considers his book to be outdated and in many respects erroneous, as the arguments expressed in it oscillate between a materialist approach and the Hegelian conception of the identity of subject and object, which implies a negation of dialectics in nature. Also, Lukács noted that in the exposition of alienation, Lukács repeated the Hegelian error, which consists of identifying alienation with objectivity in general. Lukács' protest was published through his friend E. Bottigelli's letter to Argument. Bottigelli reminded the journal's editorial board that in November 1955, Georg Lukács had already complained about the use that Maurice Merleau-Ponty made of his book in a letter addressed to the editors of Cahiers du Communisme, Communism Notebooks is what that translates as. Argument's response pointed out that they had paid the greatest attention to the criticisms that Lukács formulated in his past theses. However, they asserted that the collection of articles that constitute Lukács' history and class consciousness is part of a cultural asset common to all humanity. Despite Lukács' self-criticism and protest, Arguments was of the opinion that it was its duty to make this known to French readers, who are not familiar with what constituted a critical moment in Marxist thought. In Argument's opinion, Lukács' book belongs to the history of Marxism and to history in general. End footnote. However, Arguments continued with the publication of another of the most important chapters of Lukács' book, and despite Lukács' persistent objections to the publication of History and Class Consciousness in French, Axelos proceeded with the publication of the book. Footnote. At the end of the translation of this chapter, Axelos wrote a note of translation, in which Axelos referred to language and stylistic problems in Lukács' attempt to write Lukács' book originally in German, and Axelos ended up noting somewhat ironically, quote, "Too bad Lukács did not make his stylistic self-criticism," end quote. Axelos. That's funny. After the publication of History and Class Consciousness in French, Lukács sent a letter to Arguments to complain once again about its publication without the authorization of the author. Lukács clarified that he objected to the publication not just for formal copyright reasons, but primarily for real scientific reasons. According to Lukács' History and Class Consciousness, which was first published in 1923, is not only old and outdated, but its content could also be misleading in relation to the current clarification of philosophical problems, as it was written at the time of Lukács' transition from Hegel's objective idealism to dialectical materialism, combining the two approaches in an inorganic manner. In an inorganic mixture. End footnote. In his preface to the French edition of History and Class Consciousness, Axelos opined that the perspective that Lukács tried to open up in his collection of essays was that of totality. Footnote. In his preface, Axelos detailed the history of the condemnation of the book and Lukács' intellectual oscillations and self-criticism, emphasizing that the book was attacked by both the official Orthodox Soviet Marxist-Leninist and Kautsky social democracy in the name of scientificism, objectivism, and natural sciences, in a word, of positivism. For Axelos' History and Class Consciousness, one of the cornerstones of 20th century Marxist thought was being expelled from history and consciousness without being made available to the working class. Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism, and social democracy, and both far-right and peaceful bourgeois thinking, buried it in silence. Removed from official history by the thoughtless right and the stupidly orthodox left, this heretical book nevertheless exerted considerable influence underground. End footnote. However, according to Axelos, Lukács's theorizing involved not just fragmentary thought about the open totality, but also a total and practical will of consciousness. Lukács did not have a perspective on the role of thought in world history, and as a result, Lukács grasped that history from the exclusive standpoint of political action and the practical consciousness of the proletariat. Consequently, by rigidly separating truth from wandering, Lukács lacked a planetary horizon. Footnote. Axelos also briefly outlines Lukács's concept of, quote, reification, and comments on the difficulties of the translation and Lukács's use of the German language. End footnote. Argument published translations of the works of other critical scholars including Adorno, Marcuse, and Korsch, who were relatively unknown in France. Introducing Adorno's translated articles in 1959, Axelos argued that Axelos recognized in Adorno a thinker who had the merit of trying to think, something which sounded like a tautology, but which was rather rare in a period of academic scholasticism and conservatism, technical and instrumental rationality, superficiality, vulgarization of thought, and positivism. According to Axelos, the Frankfurt Institute endeavored to combine theoretical research and empirical inquiry, avoiding political sectarianism and dogmatism, while at the same time being careful not to succumb to positivism. As Axelos noted, Adorno's thinking came after the repression of Lukács and Korsch's intellectual efforts. Experiencing both an internal and external exile, and in his own way the Nietzschean vision of nihilism, Adorno continued the struggle against the forms and forces of reification and against idols and ideology. By contradicting Hegel and inhabiting the world of the broken totality, Adorno's statement that, quote, the whole is the false, unquote, makes Adorno appear to be an opponent of totality. In Axelos's opinion, the reason for Adorno saying this is related to the fact that Adorno constantly denounced totalitarian regimes and therefore identified totality with totalitarianism. However, Axelos argues that only open and multidimensional totality, the totality of the non-totality, is and remains the tomb of all political and technocratic totalitarianism. If it loses sight of the, quote, totality, any anti-totalitarian struggle slips into ideology or into empty, unproductive activism. And Axelos asks, for in spite of being broken and dislocated, invisible and highly problematic, doesn't the totality of the becoming, being of the world, constitute, even in a non-constitutive way, the supreme horizon? And isn't what is too quickly called error the other side of that same truth? In addition to maintaining a key role in the journal, Axelos launched and directed the book series Argument, which translated and published writers such as Korsch, Marcuse, Trotsky, Hilferding, Carr, Hegel, Novalis, Bataille, Deleuze, Jaspers, and Wittfogel. In a parallel way to Axelos' undertaking, another attempt to open up Marxism within the journal Argument circle was made in the work of Maximilien Rubel, who lived from 1905 to 1996, and Daniel Guérin, who lived from 1904 to 1988. Rubel, who had links with the Councilist movement, was in frequent correspondence with Karl Korsch and Anton Pannekoek, stressed the fact that the preponderance of the perceptions that grasp Marxism as a state doctrine and party ideology overshadowed the libertarian spirit of Marx. Rubel summarized his approach succinctly by stating that, quote, under the name communism, Marx developed a theory of anarchism, end quote. One of Rubel's assumptions is that in Marx's writings, the critique of politics and the state preceded the critique of political economy. However, Marx's negation of the state remained in ill-deserved obscurity due to its misuse by the ruling class and Stalinist regimes. Marxism was widely and commonly misapprehended as an ideology of the state. From being a fierce critique of the state, the Marxian critical theory was transformed into a statist ideology. Conversely, according to Rubel, quote, Marx's social criticism, the very substance of Marx's work, has two main targets, money and the state, end quote. Rubel. As Rubel considered that these two institutions, as Marx considered that these two institutions were incompatible with freedom and constitute a barrier to human emancipation. Marx's analysis gave added depth to the anarchist ideas and critiques, and through his concurrent critique of the state and capital, he developed a theory of anarchism. Consequently, Marx could be perceived as a, quote, theoretician of anarchism, end quote. Rebel. I have the piece by Rebel on this channel, Marx's theoretician of anarchism. I'm not sure of the exact title, but it's something like that. Rebel's grasp of Marx's critical theory therefore amounts to an openness to the unknown and libertarian Marx within Marxism as ideology, mythology, and, quote, universal process of mystification, end quote. This openness contravenes the idea of Marxism as a semi-religious doctrine, enclosed system, and seeks to establish and open a, quote, real dialogue with Marx, the author of an unfinished and amendable work entitled Capital, end quote. Rebel. One could broadly argue that there is certainly a substantial parallelism between the, quote, anarchist Marx, and, quote, of Maximilien Rebel and the, quote, libertarian communism, and, quote, of Daniel Guérin. Rebel's work and influence are present as an undercurrent of Guérin's writings, although he did not hesitate to note that Rebel was, to quote, some extent tendentious when, bracket, he passes off, and bracket, Marx as a, quote, libertarian, end quote. Daniel Guérin. What emerges in Guérin's thought is an argument for a, quote, close critical examination, end quote, of original Marxism in order to retain the, quote, elements which have a family tie with anarchism, end quote. Guérin. In this sense, Guérin pointed out that the thought and practice of Rosa Luxemburg, quote, is one of the links between anarchism and authentic Marxism, end quote. The openness in Guérin's approach is indicated in Marxism's openness to anarchism, and vice versa. That is, the openness in Guérin's approach is an openness that aims to achieve a synthesis between Marxism and anarchism. Equally important, this openness of Marxism must not only be substantiated towards openness to theoretical experiences and constructive anarchist ideas, but must also be displayed in an openness towards the, quote, practical experiences, end quote. That is the past libertarian and anti-authoritarian social struggles for human emancipation. A major theme of Guérin's critique of authoritarian and sectarian Marxism concerns its perception of historical materialism. As he put it, quote, historical materialism should not be reduced to a simple determinism, end quote. On the contrary, as an example of his understanding of openness, Guérin emphatically argued that the, quote, door must stay open to individual free will and the revolutionary spontaneity of the masses, end quote. Guérin. Guérin was not just a contributor to the journal Argument. Guérin would also establish connections with Karl Korsch, as well as with members of the first generation of the Frankfurt School when they lived in the United States, and the group Socialisme ou Barbarie in France. I'm not sure, but I think, I don't know if they're in the same group, but I know in the late 1940s, Socialisme ou Barbarie and Daniel Guérin were both in the, I'm pretty sure at least, I mean I know Socialisme ou Barbarie were in the PCR, the Parti Communiste Internationaliste in France, which is the main Trotskyist party there. And I think they signed joint declarations. There was a big Trotskyist, there was this, like, the Second Congress of the Fourth International in 1948, which is kind of like the final straw for a lot of people in the left of the Trotskyist movement, which made them fundamentally break with Trotskyism, just the way that was all handled, and the continued insistence on using the degenerated worker state label to apply it to the Soviet Union. I'm not exactly sure if precisely by that point they were calling the states, the so-called people's democracies of Eastern Europe, deformed worker states, meaning they were born deformed, bureaucratically formed. But it was like the final straw for a lot of people. Socialisme ou Barbarie obviously would go on to form Socialisme ou Barbarie, which take on like libertarian socialist positions with like a complicated relationship to Leninism, depending on who you view as the main force, whether it's Castoriadis or Lafleur. Castoriadis. being more, at least in this period, being more Leninist than before. So they left Trotskyism, but so did Gorin, so did Johnson Forrest, C.L.R. James, and Raya Danievskaya in this period. So did Trotsky's widow, Natalia Sedova Trotsky. And also, even though they might call themselves Trotskyists in some extent, and definitely viewed themselves as Leninist in some capacity, the Workers' Party, which became the Independent Socialist League, when it frankly acknowledged that it was too small of a group to label itself meaningfully a party, which I think is a particularly brave thing to do and quite uncommon compared to other sects. I think that's one of the things that marks them as a sect, marks them as a non-sect, is that they retreated from self-aggrandizing declarations about their own activity and were critical of their leaders. So when Max Shachtman started making more Cold War, having more Cold Warish positions, prominent people within the party disagreed with him. And granted, he fundamentally dissolved the Independent Socialist League into the Socialist Party of the United States. People like his Shachtman, he was obviously a very important, charismatic personality, didn't constitute the whole of the movement, right? It wasn't like there wasn't a fidelity to Shachtman. Even if Shachtman was an impressive figure, he was still someone who could be scrutinized. But yeah, sorry, I'm getting off track here, but I'm just saying that I think this relationship to socialism or barbarie goes back more than just like a little bit further than just mere contact. But I'm not sure. It'd be a very interesting thing to find out. I'd very much like to know more about socialism or barbarie's relationship with Daniel Gorin, since they both come from the left of Trotskyism. Anyway, interestingly and not coincidentally, Gorin's, quote, libertarian communism, end quote, and the, quote, anarchist Marx, end quote, of Rebel bears significant resemblance to ideas that were further expanded in the later development of other trends of open Marxism, mainly manifested in the writings of Johannes Agnoli and the CSE in Britain. Footnote: the Council Communist Libertarian Congress, on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the suppression of the Sailor Uprising in Kronstadt in March 1921, which was held at the TU Berlin, Technical University of Berlin, in 1971, was one of these occasions of exchange and transmission of ideas within the open Marxist tradition. Echoing the climate of expanded politicization of the 1968 movement, the Congress, entitled Alle Macht den Räten, nicht der Partei, Kronstadt Congress in der TU West Berlin. All power goes to the councils, not to the party. Kronstadt Congress at the TU West Berlin was a characteristic example of an interest in radical alternatives to the existing socialism of the Chinese or Soviet type, and a public space for the communication and cross-fertilization of councilist and anarchist ideas. Among the speakers of the Congress were Johannes Agnoli, Daniel Gorin, and Kaho Brendel, whose interventions were published in a pamphlet under the title Materialheft zum Kronstadt Kongress, Berlin, 11th May 71, Technical University, Berlin. Ohne Verlagsangabe, 1971. Agnoli's paper Bemerkung über Spontaneität und Organisation was republished in Johannes Agnoli 1998 in the book 1968 und die Folgen. And obviously Ka-Ira is kind of associated with Joachim Brun, who I think learned a lot from Agnoli, and Kaira publishes a lot of anti-Deutsche stuff. The description of the book says, the recent publication of, quote, subversive theory and, quote, fascism without revision, as volumes 3 and 4 of the planned 8-volume edition, Kaira now presents the 5th volume, Johannes Agnoli's work on the German and Italian student movement. The book brings together essays on critical theory, the relationship between the APO and the workers' movement, and the critique of Leninism. It shows what the protest movement could have become had it developed a radical critique of politics. As it was, however, it became trapped in the illusion of the, quote, long march through the institutions, and, quote, and succumbed to the transformational achievements of democracy. The opposition became a new elite. 1/3 of the volume contains works translated from Italian for the first time by Ulrike Hoffmann. Back to the text. Also, Agnoli in his work refers to Maximilien Rubel, an anarchist in France, who, in a manner akin to his approach, thinks that Marx is a better anarchist than Bakunin, because at least Marx had and provided a theoretical foundation of anarchy. Another indicative example of the continuity and cross-fertilization of ideas between the different generations and trends within the open Marxist tradition is that Kaho Bendel's speech in the 1971 conference in Berlin was translated and published under the title Kronstadt, Proletarian Spin-Off of the Russian Revolution in Werner Bonafelt and Sergio Tischler's edited volume, What is to be Done? Leninism, Anti-Leninist Marxism, and the Question of Revolution Today. I have large sections of that book on this channel, but I do not have Kronstadt, the Proletarian Spin-Off of the Russian Revolution, because I started recording for books after I read that piece. Yeah, you should check that out. It's weird that he called Rubel an anarchist, because I don't think he would call himself an anarchist. New section. The open Marxist tradition in Eastern Europe. The Praxis School, Poland, and the case of Karol Kosik. A particular Marxist tradition was formed under the name of, quote, open Marxism, shared by critical Marxists from Eastern Europe, and emerged during the post-Stalinist period in countries such as Yugoslavia, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. Within this critical tradition, it seemed that the term, quote, open Marxism covered a range of different positions, including those of East European dissident scholars who struggled against both the repression of the Stalinist bureaucratic regimes and the closed, dogmatic, pseudo-scientific versions of official Marxism, Leninism, Stalinism. Milovan Žilas perceived this development as one of the initial stages of the demolition of Stalinist dogmatism and authoritarianism, and noted that, quote, Leszek Kolakowski in Poland, Karol Kosik in Czechoslovakia, and Gajo Petrovic and Mihailo Markovic in Yugoslavia have already reached a, quote, open Marxism in their criticism, end quote. Žilas understood, quote, open Marxism as a Marxism that, quote, is not monopolistic but is regarded as viable in confrontations with other theories and views, end quote. Indeed, a critical, creative, and open Marxist current arguably emerged, was formulated and evolved in the former Yugoslavia in the 1950s and crystallized in the 1960s with the formation of the Praxis School. Footnote. For a representative collection of writings by the members of the Praxis School, see Markovic and Petrovic's 1979 volume, Praxis, Yugoslav Essays in the Philosophy and Methodology of the Social Sciences. End footnote. The Praxis Group published the philosophical journal Praxis from 1964 to 1974 and also organized the Corcula Summer School 1963 to 1974. The French journal Argument had links with the Praxis Group in Yugoslavia. Footnote, they also had links with other East European publications such as Nowa Kultura in Poland. And footnote. Axelos, Glenin, and Rubel were contributors to the journal Praxis from 1964 to 1974, and Axelos is on its editorial board. Along with Glenin and Rubel and Lefebvre, Axelos participated in the Praxis Summer School in Corcula, which became a meeting point and a platform for a critical exchange of ideas between radical thinkers and for dissident and critical Marxists from the East and West. I don't know if he'll say this, but also one of the places, at least textually, where these people were brought together was in the Marxist, Socialist Humanism Compendium, edited by Erich Fromm. For instance, Rubel is in there. I don't think Lenin is in there, but Rubel is in there. Raya Doneyevskaya is in there, but also these people like Markovich and so forth. And I have a lot of those pieces on this channel. Anyway, moving on. Acting as an open form of Marxist intellectual discourse, it facilitated the dialogue of intellectuals of different forms of Marxism and promoted the international transmission of critical Marxist ideas. The Praxis School consisted of a generation of Yugoslav philosophers and social scientists who came to the universities in Belgrade and Zagreb after having joined the partisan army. Thus, they experienced the fight against fascism during the German occupation, and they also witnessed and were at the forefront of the conflict with Stalinism. Among other scholars like Gajo Petrovich, Svetozar Stojanovic, Mihailo Markovich, and Milan Kongrega were members of the group. Striving for a new, free, just, and open socialist society, the group developed a highly critical attitude towards, quote, bureaucracy and any bureaucratic reduction of socialism to a merely material growth, to an impersonal sheep-like collectivism which human individuality was sacrificed and human relationships distorted into political relationships, end quote. Markovich. Far from being a homogeneous group theoretically, they remained in the tradition of Marx and sought to provide a humanist Marxist perspective, mainly through a new reading of Marx's early manuscripts. They thus generated an open-ended and developing Marxist social theory which was in opposition to the closed and dogmatic orthodox Marxism in both its Stalinist and social democratic variants. In a letter addressed to the readers and subscribers of Praxis in 1975, in which the close of the journal was announced, the Praxis editorial board noted, quote, "We once again wish to affirm that the members of the editorial board of Praxis in their activity have stood and stand on the principles of the critical and open Marxism and the humanistic and self-managing socialism which they clearly proclaimed in the first issue of the journal, in which they attempted to defend and develop in the course of 10 years of its publication," end quote, cited in Share, 1977. The critical, creative, and open Marxism of the Praxis Group indicated an openness to dialogue and critical discussion of heretical and unorthodox ideas. It fostered a debate in favor of diversity and open criticism and against the bureaucratic uniformity and the party-state enforced consensus. By cultivating an open and unbiased critique, they sought to stimulate an open public dialogue in relation to vital social and political questions, a, quote, reopening of many problems that were closed by Stalinism, end quote. Petrovich, 1967. The key themes of, quote, praxis and, quote, alienation occupied a central position in this new reading and interpretation of Marxist thought with a view to going along with Marx beyond Marx. This undertaking involved an open and, quote, critical contact with historical experience, end quote. Stojanovic. And a thoroughgoing critique of orthodox Marxism. For its further development and advancement, Marxism also had to, quote, open itself, end quote, to the, quote, other humanistic orientations, end quote, such as, quote, socialism, personalism, existentialism, and so on, end quote. Stojanovic. I don't know if I'm saying this person's name. It could be Stojanovic. It's Stojanovic with an accent, so I have no idea. Marx's thought was perceived neither as a, quote, all-embracing and finished system, end quote, nor as a, quote, eternal truth for all time, end quote. Rather, Marx's critical project was deemed to be, quote, full of open problems. It contains questions without answers, searches without final results, unquote. Petrovich. The term, quote, open Marxism was used in a similar fashion in Poland by Julian Hochfeld, who lived from 1911 to 1966, and his students, among whom were Zygmunt Bauman, Jerzy Wiater, Maria Hershevich, and Alexandra Yasinska-Kania, to define the intellectual circle's distinct theoretical viewpoint and contribution to the development of Polish Marxism. According to Jerzy Wiater, I don't know if I'm saying this person's name right, Wiater, in 1956, the climate of political liberalization and gradual de-Stalinization resulted in the revival of sociology in Polish universities and facilitated debates concerning the revision of Marxist social theory in the spirit of, quote, open Marxism, influenced by the ideas of Kazimierz Keles-Krauss, and to a certain extent echoing and responding to Ossowski's prior articulate plea for, quote, open Marxism. Hochfeld's project of, quote, open Marxism consisted of three elements. A, an urgent need to treat all the theses and claims of Marxism as verifiable scientific theses, not as fixed, closed, and quasi-religious dogmas, as was the case with the institutionalized Marxism of the Second and Third Internationals. B, a willingness to incorporate newly discovered and scientifically verifiable claims into Marxism, and by extension, C, a readiness to enrich Marxism by drawing on new social phenomena and conducting empirical sociological research. Unquote. Jerzy Wiater. Raciborski described Polish, quote, open Marxism in similar terms, but also highlighted its objective to revive and reevaluate past Marxist thinkers such as Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Kautsky, and the Austro-Marxists. He also stressed that, quote, open Marxism interpreted the concept of, quote, ideology through the lens of Marx's early writings, seeing as having a mystifying character and being in total contrast to the concept of scientific ideology advocated by Lenin. Finally, Raciborski argued that, quote, open Marxism showed an openness to empirical social research and used the methods and techniques of modern bourgeois sociology to elucidate the empirical world of contemporary society. Moreover, quote, open Marxism portrayed an openness to the achievements of scientists with different theoretical orientations. In this account, Wiater considers Bauman's early work on British socialism and the evolution of the British labor movement a characteristic and interesting example of applying the, quote, open Marxism approach, because Zygmunt Bauman combined the Marxist theory of class conflict and elite theory in an innovative way. On the other hand, Alexandra Kania wrote of her early encounter with Bauman and the theoretical orientation of their work under the supervision of Julian Hochfeld. Quote, we aim to develop Hochfeld's idea of a, quote, open and humanistic Marxism, end quote. Our views at the time were considered, quote, revisionist, understood to be an interpretation of Marxist ideas that was critical of the direction taken by the ruling party, end quote. Alexandra Kania. This struggle for, quote, open Marxism was the product of a long-term tradition of openness, critique, heterodoxy, and pluralism that entirely contravened the rigid and sectarian doctrine of institutional Marxism. In a similar manner, by substituting the official dogma and reality of Stalinism to an incisive critique, Kolakowski pointed out in his early work that the term, quote, Marxism was reduced to a, quote, concept of institutional rather than intellectual content, end quote. Kolakowski. As was the case with religious tenets conjoined with the church. This institutionalization and conformism of Marxism led to its compliance and subordination to power and to the loss of its credibility and its intellectual critical functions. Instead of being a social critique, Marxist thought became a fixed, symbolic, conventional, and formal mental procedure, which meant an uncritical espousal of institutionally authorized positions and policies. Kolakowski made the claim that the most fundamental distinction in opposition is not between orthodox Marxism and revisionism, but between the right and the left in the humanities. Hence, he attempted to succinctly encapsulate the defining and distinctive characteristics that distinguish the critical role of the, quote, intellectual left in the humanities, and, quote, radical rationalism in thinking, criticism pushed to criticism's utmost limits, distrust of all closed doctrines and systems, striving for open-mindedness, that is, readiness to revise accepted theses, theories, and methods, end quote. Kolakowski. In Adam Schaff's opinion, too, if Marxism represented any kind of system, it had to be a, quote, open system. This openness reflected the, quote, open, dialogue-prone, and tolerant nature of Marxism, end quote. Adam Schaff. Which, as a school of thought that continues to be a militant philosophy, is well prepared and equipped to enter into a productive and creative dialogue with a wide range of humanisms in order to achieve their mutual interaction, development, and improvement. As a result of its method, critical approach and principles, Marxism amounts to a, quote, open theory, the propositions of which are open to modification and alterations. As it develops, Marxism absorbs new philosophical elements and meets novel theoretical and practical challenges. However, for Adam Schaff, this theoretical openness is constrained by certain limitations, which are determined by the fundamental tenets and theses of the Marxist theory itself. In the case of the open Marxist tradition in Eastern Europe, the most important, insightful, original, and creative contribution was arguably made by Karol Kosik in Czechoslovakia. As Dunajevskaya remarked in her review of Adorno's Negative Dialectics and Kosik's Dialectics of the Concrete, they are not only, quote, the most serious contribution to the study of dialectics in the past half-century, but path-breaking originals, end quote. Dunajevskaya. In what is considered to be his magnum opus, the undeservedly neglected or forgotten Dialectics of the Concrete, published in 1963, as well as in some of his other works, Kosik laid out a critical and open interpretation of Marxism, which combined a critical reading of existentialism, phenomenology, and Marxism, with a critical confrontation with other Marxist scholars and structuralism. He also laid particular stress on the critique of positivism, scientificism, and economism. Kosik's critical project amounts to a process of demystification, which rejects the ideology of Stalinism and orthodox Marxism and unmasks their anti-humanist and anti-socialist essence. By raising questions such as, quote, what is man, quote, what is socialism, quote, what is democracy, or, quote, what is the meaning of revolution, end quote, Kosik sought to demonstrate in his work that, quote, Stalinism was not a deformation of a particular concept of socialism, but a full realization of an entirely different conception of socialism, end quote. In a similar vein, from 1991 onwards, Kosik launched a social critique against the capitalist neoliberal ideology. Quote, this ideology occludes reality, keeps people in the dark like a dark cave, so they see nothing, end quote. In this movement from the dark cave of Stalinism to the dark cave of capitalist neoliberalism, the function of theory is to spur the development of critical thought, that is, to, quote, illuminate every cave, end quote. Kosik. Hence, for Kosik, open Marxism and humanist socialism acted as a liberating and revolutionary alternative that signified the radical negation of both capitalism and Stalinism. Kosik went to great pains to stress that to, quote, abandon the essential to the non-essential is the real meaning of the claim that, quote, God is dead, end quote, end quote. But what is the essential, and how do we get to the essential? Kosik's postulates for a, quote, objective socialist society, end quote, a society of free and equal socialist citizens, was underpinned by a critical and open Marxist undertaking, the main task of which was to, quote, re-examine everything from the ground up, to question even the most, quote, obvious phenomena, to analyze matters which were apparently crystal clear, end quote. Kosik. According to Kosik, the world appears to be a collection of natural, self-evident, and outwardly autonomous material and spiritual phenomena, which constitute the world of the pseudo-concrete. Dialectics implies the obliteration of the pseudo-concrete, that is, the destructive critique of all ossified, petrified, and reified forms of social reality, thus revealing them as the products of human praxis and creations of specific historical and social conditions. In contrast to the base superstructure model of orthodox Marxism, Kosik's focal point of critical social analysis is deployed through the distinction between phenomenon and essence, the world of the pseudo-concrete, manifests itself as as economic, political, moral, or cultural phenomena, as phenomenal forms that obtain a semblance of autonomy, regularity, immediacy, self-evidence, and naturalness. In reality, however, these, quote, phenomenal forms, unquote, the phenomenal aspects of things, conceal the essence of things even as they reveal it. Forms only exist because, and as a result, of their essence, with which they stand in an internal relationship. A phenomenon constitutes a manifestation of the essence, and at the same time, it works to conceal the essence of things, the structure of reality, the being of existence in the realm of human praxis and social relations. Quote, reality for Kosick, quote, is the unity of the phenomenon and essence, end quote. Nevertheless, in the social reality in which the pseudo-concrete prevails, the, quote, phenomenal aspect of the thing, in which a thing reveals and conceals itself, is considered to be properly the essence, and the distinction between the phenomenon and the essence disappears. The distinction between the phenomenon and the essence disappears, end quote. Kosick. The different forms of the world of the pseudo-concrete present themselves as autonomous, absolute, and natural events. Hence, dialectical thinking is needed to interrogate the pseudo-concrete and to reveal the falseness of the pseudo-concrete's apparent independence in order to reach the concrete and to demonstrate decisively that these facets are derivative and mediated phenomenon of social praxis and human social relations, organized in a historically specific, concrete manner. In addition, Kosick's perception of open Marxism is associated with the concept of praxis. To conceptualize social reality means to comprehend social reality, and this understanding in turn implies knowledge of social reality's structure as the creation of human praxis. Quote, to interpret the world concretely, the interpretation itself must be grounded in revolutionary praxis. End quote. Quote, to interpret the world critically, the interpretation itself must be grounded in revolutionary praxis. End quote. Kosick. Kosick decried the contemptuous and condescending readings of Husserl and Heidegger, which dominate official and institutional Marxism. Kosick's key claim is that both existentialism and phenomenology could provide some valuable insights into the question of man and man's activity. Kosick not only considered Husserl's book, Crisis of European Sciences, to be very important, but also saw Husserl's book, Crisis of European Sciences, as an attempt to awaken, quote, democratic awareness and a defense of reason against the danger of fascism, end quote. Kosick. Kosick also pointed out that, quote, Husserl's book, Crisis of European Sciences, philosophical content ranks among the seminal intellectual achievements of the first half of the 20th century, end quote. Karl Kosick. In this sense, Kosick's open Marxism can be understood as a critical and fruitful dialogue between Marxism, phenomenology, and existentialism. Through the lens of his open Marxist perspective, Kosick coined the concept of, quote, concrete totality, end quote, to distinguish it from Lukasz's concept of totality. Lukács perceived the category of totality from a partial and unilateral viewpoint, thus losing its dialectical nature. The concept of totality was accordingly reduced to a, quote, methodological precept, a methodological rule for investigating reality, end quote. The concept of totality was accordingly reduced to a, quote, methodological precept, a methodological rule for investigating reality, end quote. Kosick. Consequently, it ended up having two trivial connotations, quote, that everything is connected with everything else, and that the whole is more than the sum of its parts, end quote. Kosick. For Kosick, a dialectical conception of totality suggests that the parts are interconnected and internally interact, not only among themselves, but also with the whole. In this dynamic process, the whole, seen as a totality, cannot be grasped as a fixed and rigid abstraction that stands above the individual components and is superior to the individual components, because totality, the whole, forms itself in and through the interaction of its specific segments and discrete elements. Dialectical thinking satisfies itself neither by grasping just facts nor by describing events and depicting relations and processes. What is more important, dialectic seeks to comprehend the process of the genesis, formation, and structure of social phenomena. Reinforcing his point, Kosick maintained that the, quote, process of forming the whole and of forming a unity, the unity of contradictions, and its genesis, all belong to the dialectical whole, unquote. Reinforcing Kosick's point, Kosick maintained that the, quote, process of forming the whole and of forming a unity, the unity of contradictions, and the unity of contradictions' genesis, all belong to the dialectical whole, unquote. Karol Kosick. Kosick's open Marxism and Kosick's concept of, quote, concrete totality, unquote, conceive totality in totality's genetic and dynamic unfolding, and place emphasis on its origins, process of formation, movement, and contradictions. Quote, totality concretizes totality's self in the process of forming totality's whole, as well as totality's content, end quote. Quote, totality concretizes totality's self in the process of forming totality's whole, as well as totality's content, end quote. Hence, Kosick impugns and rebutes totality as a, quote, ready-made or formalized whole, determining the parts because the genesis and development of totality are components of totality's very determination, end quote. Karol Kosick. I could be pronouncing it wrong. It could be pronounced like Carl. But I don't know. New section. Johannes Agnoli and the CSE Open Marxist stream in the UK. Corcula Summer School and the theoretical activity of the Praxis School acted as a link and an osmotic space for critical Marxist ideas from both the West and the East. They communicated and crystallized certain ideas and readings of Marx's work, and on several occasions it was possible to define the boundaries between the critical Marxism trends and the dogmatic variants of Soviet Marxism or structuralism. In this regard, they arguably facilitated the transmission of ideas between the Praxis School, the other Eastern and Western European critical Marxists, and most importantly, members of the first-generation Frankfurt School critical theory. I realized just now I missed some footnotes. Several footnotes, actually. Let's see. First footnote that I missed. Referring to Kazimierz Kraus's, quote, open Marxism in Poland, and explaining how open Marxism makes a selective use of Marx in combination with other theories, Pelczynski wrote, quote, it was, I believe, Kellis Kraus who first used the term, quote, open Marxism in Poland. Kellis Kraus wished the thought of Karl Marx to be accessible to new ideas and revised in the light of new developments. It is my contention that this, quote, openness has in fact marked the intellectual history of Polish Marxism, except for a short spell of some 5 or 6 years, from 1950 to 1955. Its concomitants have been a lack of tradition of orthodoxy and a pluralism of interpretations, end quote. Pelczynski, 1977, end footnote. Footnote. For Pelczynski, quote, the Polish traditions of, quote, open Marxism, end quote, scored perhaps its greatest triumph when the leading Polish Marxist-Leninists, the bastion of orthodoxy and the scourge of all revisionisms, end quote, that is, Adam Schaff, quote, declared his adherence to it in 1962, end quote. Pelczynski, 1977. And footnote. Footnote. See also on this Karol Kosick, 1995, The Crisis of Modernity, Essays and Observations from the 1968 Era, edited by James L. Satterwhite. Especially the article, the essay Reason and Conscience, the article Our Present Crisis, the article Socialism and the Crisis of Modern Man, the article Dialectics of Morality and the Morality of Dialectics. Quote. See also Carol Kosik's article Classes and Real Structure of Society of 1958, published in Contradictions, a Journal of Critical Thought. And footnote. Footnote. Branislav Yakovlevich argues that, quote, through its editorial and curatorial decisions in praxis and the Korčula Summer School, Yugoslav humanist Marxists also filtered out some prominent new ideas that started emerging in the 1950s and 1960s. For example, while tolerating Sartre and keeping closely in touch with French Marxists such as Lucien Goldman, Henri Lefebvre, and Kostas Axelos, they ignored or actively excluded much of the French Marxist theory of the period. End quote. Yakovlevich refers characteristically to the recollections of Milan Kongruga, I don't know if I'm saying that person's name right, one of the founding members of the journal Praxis, quote, about a 50-page article the journal editors received in 1965 from an unknown Marxist philosopher, end quote. In Kongruga's words, quote, I wrote a devastating review and concluded my evaluations of the article by stating that it is below the level of Praxis publications because it was written from a positivist Stalin position, end quote. According to Yakovlevich, quote, the name of the author was Louis Althusser, and Kongruga leaves little doubt that the article he submitted was one of his most celebrated works, Ideology and the Ideological State Apparatus, end quote. Yakovlevich. End footnote. And footnote. See also Marjan Ivkovich's 2017 article, Praxis Philosophy's, quote, older sister, the reception of critical theory in this former Yugoslavia. The fifth meeting of the Korčula Summer School, for instance, took place between the 14th and 24th of August 1968 and coincided with the Soviet Union-led Warsaw Pact troops' invasion of Czechoslovakia, which is strongly and publicly condemned by the participants. The conference was organized in honor of Karl Marx's 150th birthday and was entitled, quote, Marx and the Revolution. The participants included, among others, the members of the Praxis School, Ernst Bloch, Herbert Marcuse, Ernst Fischer, Erich Fromm, Agnes Heller, Kurt H. Wolf, Kostas Axelos, Eugen Fink, Jürgen Habermas, Irving Fetcher, Norman Berenbaum, and Alfred Zone Reitel. The contributions of the 1968 conference were published in Praxis, Volume 5, Issues 1 to 2, 1969. Other conferences and issues of Praxis were participated in and contributed to by critical scholars such as Lucien Goldman, Henri Lefebvre, Leszek Kolakowski, Karol Kosik, Maximilien Rubel, and Daniel Gorin. Okay, so I'll try not to keep missing footnotes. There was even a critical exchange about the work of the second generation of critical theorists such as Alfred Schmidt. Sorry, so let me reread that. Let me start where I was. New section, the CSE Open Marxist Stream in the UK. Korčula Summer School and the theoretical activity of the Praxis School acted as a link and an osmotic space for critical Marxist ideas and from both the West and the East. They communicated and crystallized certain ideas and readings of Marx's work, and on several occasions it was possible to define the boundaries between the critical Marxist trends and variants and the dogmatic variants of Soviet Marxism or structuralism. In this regard, they arguably facilitated the transmission of ideas between the Praxis school and the other Eastern and Western European critical Marxists, and most importantly, members of the first generation Frankfurt School of critical theory. There was even a critical exchange about the work of the second generation of critical theorists, such as Alfred Schmidt. This circulation of ideas among critical and open Marxists took place at several levels, had various ramifications, and communicated the new approaches to Marxist work to the next generation of critical scholars. A typical example of this transmission of ideas was arguably that of Irving Fetcher, who played an active role in the Korkula Summer School. Irving Fetcher, whose book, Marx and Marxism, I think it's called, is on this channel. Irving Fetcher acted as a link between the different critical Marxist strains and to a certain extent as a creative interlocutor who facilitated the exchange of ideas between Western and Eastern critical scholars. It seems that this position gave him a pivotal role, although not fully recognized and appreciated in a political and intellectual conjuncture in which a radical undertaking to bring new life to Marx's critique of political economy was attempted. What is particularly noteworthy is that Irving Fetcher was also the supervisor of the doctoral dissertations of Moishe Pistone and Helmut Reichelt, who in turn exerted a significant influence on the theoretical evolution of the CSE open Marxist strain in Britain. Another example of this transmission of ideas was evident by the ties developed with and the direct influence that the French journal Arguments had on the establishment of the German journal Das Argument. I'm not sure, but I think Das Argument is more of a conservative or like a traditional Marxist journal in Germany. I believe it's associated with what the hell is his name? God. Can't remember his fucking name. Wolfgang Haug, I think his name is. There's I have a critique of his work on this channel. Yeah, it said that journal emerged from the protest against West German remilitarization. Since 1959, the editor-in-chief has been the Marxist philosopher Wolfgang Fritz Haug. So I think it's more of an orthodox journal. Whose politics I think were fairly apologetic to Stalinism, or at least not as critical as necessary, considering its the catastrophe of it. But apparently Agnoli contributed an article to Das Argument in the 1960s. Yeah, 1966, titled Die Bürgerliche Gesellschaft und ihr Staat. I think that's probably, I'm not sure, but I'm going to assume that's bourgeois society and its state. Let's find out if I know what I'm talking about. Let's see if I know German at all. Just for funsies. Civil society and its state, but I think if you switched it around and you said bourgeois society and its state in English, it would translate as So I think bourgeois society and civil society are kind of the same words are used in German. I'm not sure. Anyway, moving on, not important. In the late 1960s, renewed interest in radical politics and the resurgence of social, anti-capitalist, and anti-authoritarian movements facilitated the revival, diffusion, and continuation of the legacy of critical Marxism at the Frankfurt School's theoretical traditions. In Germany, this renewal found expression in part in the reassessment and further development of Marx's critique of the political economy by the, quote, new reading of Marx, as investigated by Alfred Schmidt, Hans-Georg Backhaus, and Helmut Reichelt, instigated by Alfred Schmidt, Hans-Georg Backhaus, and Helmut Reichelt, and also as a supplemental strand of the critique of political economy, manifested as the critique of politics in the state, undertaken primarily by Johannes Agnoli. In his influential Die Transformation, I don't know if they have that word, Die Transformation, I don't know how to say it in German, Der Demokratie, The Transformation of Democracy, published together with Peter Bruckner in 1967, as well as in his older critiques of politics, Agnoli questioned the transformation of parliamentary democracy into a representative mode of political power and domination, and supplies with a profound critique of the form of the capitalist state. Wikipedia says Peter Bruckner lived from 1922 to 1982 and was a German social psychologist and university professor. Due to his political commitment, Peter Bruckner became a symbolic figure of the New Left and extra-parliamentary opposition in the Federal Republic of Germany in the 1970s. Suspended twice for political reasons, all disciplinary measures against him were only lifted in 1981. Back to the text. In contrast to Axelos, Agnoli's devastating assessment of, quote, constitutional oligarchy, end quote, and parliamentarism resulted not from situating Marx's work in a, quote, productive dialogue, end quote, with Nietzsche or Heidegger, but rather Agnoli's critique of the transformation of democracy and the institutionalization of radical opposition derived from his critical and creative dialogue with left communism, anarcho-syndicalism, and revolutionary syndicalism. Equally important, but until recently not sufficiently acknowledged, was Agnoli's objective in this dialogue. In a manner akin to Rubel and Gorin, Agnoli vehemently argued that the original historical hostility, controversy, split and divide between Marxism and anarchism, communists and anarchists, had devastating and tragic effects upon the movement for human emancipation, and therefore had to be overcome. In light of the imperative need for this critical exchange, Agnoli aptly remarked that, quote, there is no, quote, that, quote, there are no sacred texts, end quote. In the theoretical and practical struggles for the, quote, association of free and equal, end quote. The quote, association of the free and equal, end quote. Books and texts, including the writings of thinkers such as Marx and Adorno, must not be studied as religious scripts or in a purely philological and pedantic manner. Reading and using them critically, and always through the, quote, power of doubt, end quote, Marxian and Marxist critical theories texts could serve as a means of analyzing and subversively negating the social and political conditions of domination, exploitation, and oppression, and of simultaneously promoting and thinking about another and different form of social synthesis. Agnoli spelt out the implications of this approach in his critical engagement with the critical theory of the early Frankfurt School. Agnoli firmly recognized the significance of its theoretical contribution, and he was scathing in his critique of Habermas, whom he did not consider a representative of critical theory in any way. Habermas had clearly given up and betrayed the emancipatory and radical project of early critical theory. Furthermore, Agnoli was very critical of Adorno's attitude towards the 1968 student movement. In Agnoli's opinion, Adorno tended to forget the totality in his analysis. Instead, he perceived only the fragments of a movement, which he generalized in a manner akin to positivism. The Adornian approach thus abandoned the postulate of changing capitalist society and became instead a constitutive element of this society. Agnoli himself was conscious of the fact that the 1968 movement would not be able to generate a council democracy, but he viewed it as a necessary revolt that would initiate something new. Above all, according to Agnoli, critical Marxist thinking is not to be identified with a specific person or school of thought. Beginning with the internal and reciprocal relationship between theory and practice, critical theory should be able not only assess political events critically, but also grasp political events in their negativity, as to say, to understand their negativity in relation to the existing situation, and thus intervene in the situation. Clearly then, as a critical theorist, Adorno had failed to grasp the emancipatory potential of what appeared to be a very confused political movement. In the course of his debate with Ernest Mandel on the meaning of Marx's understanding of and use of the concept of, quote, critique, and against the background of Althusser publicly announcing a crisis in Marxism, which sparked impassioned debates in France and Italy in 1977, Agnoli employed the term, quote, open Marxism, in an attempt to distinguish his own critical reading and use of Marxian thought from that of orthodox Marxism. Orthodox Marxism has completely changed the content and meaning of Marx's critical theory and most important principles. The idea of a, quote, socialist state, end quote, is a typical example of these changes. Orthodox Marxism seems to consider that the only way it can change its theoretical position is to, quote, open its concepts and categories to a self-contained system, and to which it has constant access, like a huge collection of knowledge, data, experience, and emblems. In this way, everything appears secure from the outset. The owner of the collection knows he has the answer no matter what question is asked. In this sense, significant theoretical and political questions are regarded as settled once and for all. The thought process and the intellectual constructions appear to be done, finished and closed, as certainty and predictability are the hallmarks of orthodox Marxist thinking. In contrast, for Agnoli, open Marxism entailed that thought processes, concepts, and categories are not conclusive, and way always open-ended, while the parameters of thinking likewise remain in motion and fluid in a critical sense. For Agnoli's open Marxism, Marx is concerned primarily with the categories of, quote, critique and destruction, end quote, and his critical project of social emancipation was in no way a Weltanschauung worldview. Negative critique and destruction could never be closed, certain, predictable, and predetermined. By emphasizing the unity of theory and practice, Agnoli's open Marxism held that concepts and categories remain open and incomplete on the grounds that the, quote, heresy of reality, end quote, and the unpredictability of the class struggle question the validity of the meaning of concepts. History is not construed according to pre-established concepts and norms. Rather, as open Marxism argues, critique connects conceptualization and unpredictability, opens theory up to the practice of definite social relations, and opens up practice to theory. Agnoli argued that a Marxist has to start from the totality of social production conditions, and that it is only within this totality that economic, social, and political questions can be clarified. However, he stressed that totality does not mean a closed system that is fixed for all time. Totality includes variance. Totality encompasses the elements of change, unpredictability, and freedom, and thereby the possibility of changing basic pillars, of expanding concepts. Otherwise, it would be impossible to keep concepts open and absorb the new dimensions that affect and at the same time validate the unity between theory and practice. 2 decades later, in 1991, the demise of the USSR and the disintegration of Soviet Marxism denigrated all the existing versions of, quote, closed institutional Marxism. This was not simply another crisis of Marxism of a sort that put into question its validity. The, quote, end of history, end quote, was announced, and the triumph of the global market society was seen as eliminating any alternative to capitalism. Against a backdrop of necrology, renunciation of radical praxis and ideas, withdrawal and pervasive pseudo-consensus, eventually as a consequence of the deep dissatisfaction with disintegrating Marxist orthodoxies and dogmas, a resurgence of a strong interest in critical open forms of Marxism came about. Traditional versions of Marxism were severely criticized, and the historical tendency to uphold the party and the state as means of emancipation and instruments of revolution was discredited and rejected. In Britain, and specifically within the Conference of Socialist Economists, this discursive development crystallized in the form of the work of a group of critical theorists under the rubric of, quote, open Marxism, which included Werner Bonafelt, Simon Clarke, Richard Gunn, and John Holloway, among others. The organic development of the, quote, open Marxism group was rooted in the fierce debates over value, productive and unproductive labor, crisis, and the state within the CSE. The CSE's original aim was to, quote, develop the critique of political economy and the analysis of contemporary society within and for the socialist movement, end quote, and in the context of a, quote, widely shared concern for the renewal of revolutionary strategy, end quote. Hugo Radis, 1980. The work of Simon Clarke was decisive in the flourishing of critical Marxist ideas within the CSE. Clarke's writings and analysis within this framework provide a powerful point of departure for a forceful critique of structuralism and the economism of the orthodox Marxism of the Second and Third Internationals, based on an alternative interpretation of Marx. As Clarke argued, quote, Marxism must be developed as a theory of liberation, a theory that embraces and does not suppress the revolutionary aspirations expressed in the experience of struggle, end quote. Simon Clarke, 1979. The emphasis placed here on the central role of self-activity and the struggles of the working class has been of paramount importance as a theoretical and political response to the bureaucratized and authoritarian practices of both the communist and social democratic parties. Drawing particularly on the most subversive and unorthodox currents in the Marxist tradition, and on Marx's Grundrisse, his critique of political economy and theory of commodity fetishism, Clarke's open Marxism rejects, quote, equally the dominant tendencies of the economistic Marxism of the Second and Third Internationals, and the complexity of post-Marxist modernism, whose sophistication was no more than a mark of its superficiality, in favor of a view of Marxism as a theory of social forms, end quote. Simon Clarke, 1988. Contrary to structural functionist approaches and perceiving Marxism as a theory of social forms, such as the economic, legal, and political forms of the capitalist mode of production, Clarke argued that the, quote, class struggle does not simply take place within these forms, end quote, but, quote, the forms of capitalist domination are themselves the object of class struggle, end quote. Simon Clarke. Within this more subversive stream of the CSE, Werner Bonafelt coined the term, quote, open Marxism in homage to his university teacher Johannes Agnoli. Open Marxism has been used by Bonafelt as a designation for a subversive and heterodox Marxism, the objective of which is the development of Marx's critique of political economy as a critique of economic categories. By opposing the naturalization of the economic categories in the orthodox Marxist tradition, Bonafelt's open Marxism conceives of them as historically specific forms of definite social relations. Consequently, it argues against the traditional conception of a socialist labor economy and the orthodox Marxist approaches which criticize capitalism from the standpoint of labor. Agnoli introduced Bonafelt to the notion of, quote, negative critique, end quote, as one of the purposes of critical thought and as the opposite of constructive, affirmative, and responsible critique. There's a footnote that I missed. Robert Fine and Peter Burnham also espoused a, quote, open Marxism approach and certain related ideas in some of their writings, while Hugo Ratis maintained a critical affiliation with the group and engaged with its specific ideas and debates with a degree of critical skepticism. On this, especially see Robert Fine's 1984 book, Democracy and the Rule of Law. Robert Fine, coming out of third camp Trotskyism. His book, Democracy and the Rule of Law, is on this channel, if you were curious. And footnote. In his 1987 article, Open Marxism, with which Bonafelt launched the first issue of the journal Common Sense, Bonafelt summarized and put forward his understanding of the postscript of Agnoli's book, Open Marxism, a debate about dogma, orthodoxy, and the heresy of reality. In this short article, one can see the key concepts that determine the future character of what came to be regarded as the CSE Open Marxist group. Quote, crisis, quote, class struggle, quote, critique and destruction, quote, demystification, quote, openness of categories, and, quote, the principle of doubt, end quote. Along with numerous, end quote, Bonafelt, 1987. Along with numerous individual and collective publications, the richness and diversity of theoretical and political discussions within the open Marxist discourse were best exemplified by the 3-volume work entitled Open Marxism, which was published between 1992 and 1995. Footnote, a 4th volume, also entitled Open Marxism, was published in 2020. However, it reads rather as a meta-theory and a disparate and disjointed collection of articles. Therefore, there is no value added in the novel and important contributions made with the republication of the first 3 volumes. On this, see Stutzler's perceptive comments concerning the differences between the first 3 volumes and the 4th volumes in Stutzler 2023. That's super interesting. I haven't looked at the third, I haven't looked at the 4th one. And footnote. As Bonafelt has noted, the 3 volumes of Open Marxism were a, quote, attempt to save the Hegelian dialectic within the Marxist tradition from the Althusserian structuralist paradigm, end quote, and an endeavor to, quote, stop thinking with preformed theoretical instruments about society, applying preformed ideas to social situations and institutions, end quote. Instead, they constitute an attempt at, quote, thinking in and through society, connecting thought with experience, end quote. Bonafelt, 2017. Together with their numerous writings of Clark, Bonafelt, Holloway, and Gunn, they provided the basic outline of a radical rethinking and re-examination of fundamental Marxian concepts and Marxist categories, rejecting at the same time the dogmatism, orthodoxy, determinism, and positivism that marked the initial phases of the development of Marxist thought. Open Marxism's critical undertaking was associated with the journals Capital and Class and Common Sense, which existed between 1987 and 1999. In contrast to Axelos's and Eastern European Open Marxism's focus on Marx's early writings, Bonafelt, Clark, Gunn, and Holloway examined Marx's work in its entirety. Their individual contributions are varied, and the disparity in their approaches must not be overlooked. However, these differences do not affect the content of their intellectual trajectory and their shared critical endeavor. There is a discernible common foundation to the work of these authors which marks the distinctive character of Open Marxism. The CSE Open Marxist main objective was to free Marx's readings and interpretations from the influences of positivism and traditional theory. Second, they endeavored to reconnect with and critically expand the past and much neglected critical Marxist currents elaborated, inter alia, by Luxemburg, the early work of Lukács, Korsch, Pannekoek, Rubin, Pashukanis, the early Frankfurt School, Rozdolsky, Johannes Agnoli, and the tradition of, quote, autonomist, end quote, Marxism. Adorno's critical theory in particular has been a touchstone for the CSE open Marxism, counteracting the mainstream reading of Adorno as a cultural critic, which could be effortlessly accommodated into the liberal academic discourse. The CSE open Marxists sought to expound Adorno's negative dialectics, elaborating on the intersection between Adorno's critical theory and Marx's critique of political economy. Footnote. See on this Bonafelt and O'Kane's 2022 book, Adorno Marx. I have a lot of the essays from that book. I'm missing a few. I think there's one from Dirk Brownstein that I'm missing. But I think I have most of them on there. And footnote. And third, they strove to open and renew Marxism, perceiving it as a critical theory of lived experience and a negative critique of society. The negative character of open Marxism's critique amounted to a radical rethinking of the meaning of critique, not as normative and constructive, but as negative and destructive. As Bonafelt put it, quote, "For a critical theory of society, it is important to think against the grain of society, so as to understand it better. Open Marxism either thinks against this grain, or open Marxism is not open to the constitutive turmoil of bourgeois society. To put this differently, the existence of class relations does not call for a Marxist class theory, nor does the existence of class relations call for an argument from the standpoint of the working class. The existence of class relations calls for a critique of class society and for a critique of the capitalistically organized form of labor," end quote. Bonafelt, 2017. Open Marxism does not propose a complete definitive interpretation of Marx. Rather, it aims to open up a space for a theoretical and practical critique that seeks to pave the way forward towards a defetishized and emancipated social world. As distinct from Axelos's and in part Kosik's understanding of the term, quote, open Marxism, openness in this context referred to the, quote, openness of Marxist categories themselves, end quote. This involved, quote, openness onto practice, end quote, that took as its starting point the, quote, class antagonism between capital and labor, end quote. This openness to the unpredictable antagonistic character of social reality underlined open Marxism's acceptance of the inevitable incompleteness of concepts and categories. Contrary to the traditional Marxist separation of theory and practice, and traditional Marxism's reproduction of the dualism between subject and structure, open Marxism holds that the object and subject, objectified structures and class struggles exist in and through an internal relationship. This means that class struggle is viewed as, quote, the movement of the contradiction in which capital itself consists, end quote. And the concept of class was grasped, quote, not as a matter of grouping, and the concept of class is grasped, quote, not as a matter of grouping individuals, but as a contradictory and antagonistic social relation, end quote. Having considered the formation and evolution of the open Marxist tradition, it is evident that it took various forms, and the concept of, quote, openness came to acquire several meanings and significations. First, open Marxism came to denote a positive interest in other intellectual traditions, particularly an attempt to have an open and productive dialogue with phenomenology, existentialism, and various kinds of humanism. Second, in parts of Eastern Europe, forms of open Marxism also entailed an opening up to empirical research and traditional theory, which could cross-fertilize ideas and reconcile or amalgamate Marxism with other sociological methods of inquiry and investigation. It was intended that this openness of Marxism would provide it with more effective methodological tools and enrich the Marxist conceptual framework. In addition, openness in Marxism, as conceived by critical and creative Marxists in both Western and Eastern Europe, involved the unfolding of a critical project that challenged the economic and political power of the one-party state. the opening of Marxist categories and concepts, and the constant interrogation of all closed theoretical systems. Open Marxism followed a policy of anti-dogmatism and was seen as a humanist and liberating alternative to Stalinist doctrine, thus claiming autonomy from the official and established forms of Marxism, including its Althusserian and structuralist variants. Third, a current of open Marxism conceived of openness as a creative synthesis between Marxism and anarchism. The implications of this approach gave rise to the idea of a, quote, anarchist Marx, and through the notion of a libertarian communism, it sought to open Marxism towards the most radical elaborations and practices of anarchism and expound on Marx's most significant libertarian and anti-authoritarian elements of his thought. Finally, open Marxism signified an openness to lived experience, human practice, and the class antagonism between capital and labor. Without ignoring the differences and inner tensions, and by drawing basically on the last two currents of the historical development of open Marxism, the main concern of this study is how the open Marxist tradition can contribute to the renewal of critical social theory, through its shared, consistent, and distinctive critique of traditional theory and institutional Marxism in all its various forms, and its negative critique of capitalist society. It expounds on how open Marxist thought could help to enrich and reformulate a powerful and subversive critical theory of capitalism in order to pave the way forward towards a free and open socialist society. That's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening.